Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, on this episode, I'm going to be covering a topic that I know is familiar to every single person listening to this. That topic, wait for it, expletive coming up, is workplace bullshit. And I'm going to talk about that topic because I recently read a piece of research called Confronting Indifference Toward Truth, Dealing with Workplace Bullshit. And it was a fascinating journey into what makes bullshit and what we can do about it. And I loved the piece of research so much that I posted about it on LinkedIn, got more positive responses, and so I reached out to the authors of the report, and I'm delighted that Ian McCarthy, who's one of the 4 authors, agreed to appear on the podcast. Ian is a Professor of Innovation and Operations Management at the Beedie School of Business, which is part of the Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada. Now, his research focuses on a broad range of topics, including, interestingly, social media. And so on the episode, I talked to him both about the paper on workplace bullshit, but also on his views in general around social media and technology and the challenges it poses. Now, the other piece of information I need to give you about Ian is that according to his biography, he also enjoys monitoring the progress of, quote, the biggest and best football club in England, Everton FC. I mention that purely because UK listeners will be aware that their main rivals are Liverpool, and during our discussion he made a suggestion that I might be a Liverpool fan. I didn't realise why at the time, but it's possible he wasn't being as nice as it seemed. However, the rest of the conversation was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to Ian. He's got some great insights. I think you are going to find this absolutely fascinating. So sit back, think about your own environments, and enjoy my discussion with Professor Ian McCarthy on workplace bullshit. Ian, welcome to the Human Risk podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Look, your research grabbed my attention with its title, and then I dived into the content and was absolutely fascinated by what you had discovered. I'm really intrigued. How did you come up with the idea of doing some research into workplace bullshit?
As you know, I'm a business professor, and I study organizations from a number of perspectives, but I also work in organizations and work with teams and colleagues. And in a world where misinformation and disinformation and misrepresentation is key, I was sort of sitting down with a number of colleagues, and we were wondering, how organizations function and why they function in terms of making decisions that seem odd or seem weird, or why people float to the top in terms of leadership roles. And during that conversation, we were confusing the concept of lying and the concept of bullshitting. Some colleagues and collaborators and students, we deal with a lot of executives, who say, oh yes, this person lies, or this person is not telling the truth. And then when we were unpacking it, we were sort of realizing that maybe they're not lying, they're what we would call bullshitting. And one of my colleagues had directed us to a work by a Princeton philosophy professor called Harry Frankfurt, who'd written this book. It's called On Bullshit, which talks about the difference between bullshitting and lying, and understanding that if you want to work with people and achieve better outcomes in organizations, understanding this distinction is very important. And then so that started us on a sort of a journey of sort of thinking, well, what is the difference and how does it work, and how can we help people to understand how to stifle bullshit and how to work better with bullshitters. And because sometimes it's bullshitters don't know that they're bullshitting, and they need to be supported and they need to be mentored, and that's the motivation behind it. So where we then sat down and started looking at the sort of literature and what people were saying around bullshit and versus lying, and particularly in a world where we are presented with so much information so easily, and we're continually questioning the sort of validity of that information.
That's fascinating. And what really intrigued me about your research was that regardless of what kind of environment you've worked in, whether that's a business or academia, you will have come across the phenomenon of workplace bullshit. It seems to be incredibly prevalent nowadays. And is that something that you think is a 21st century phenomenon? Are the working methods and technologies facilitating it, making it more commonplace? Or is this something that has always been there?
Now, I'll answer this question in one way. Like, if I was a bullshitter, I would take a stance and say yes or no. Like, but the answer is I don't know. I don't know, definitively. I have hypotheses and suggestions around this. I would say, I would imagine there would be a strong case that bullshitting in the workplace has existed forever, and then the sort of my sort of assumption or view that it's risen or increased would need to be proved by evidence. But I cannot imagine that it has not been around forever. In the same way as fake news has been around forever. It's just that maybe it's easier to produce, it's easier to distribute, it's easier to connect it with many people. And so I think we're seeing examples, particularly in the world of media and politics and marketing, where where the damage it can do in terms of channeling this sort of misrepresentation of the truth or disregard for the truth, depending on whether you're lying or bullshitting, and the impact of it. And so it's been around forever. I would say there's a good case to make that. But if someone wanted to call me out, they say, well, where's your evidence it's been around forever? And I would have to go away and find studies and evidence that people have been tracking how bullshit has risen or not risen over time in different societies, in different cultures around the world.
You mentioned in the research that there are lots of good reasons why bullshit is perpetuated and tolerated, and I'm fascinated to understand whether it's a natural consequence of human behaviour, or is there something specific in the workplace environment that makes it more prevalent than it might be outside the workplace environment?
In the workplace environment, people are stretched, starved of time, pressurized, and they're asked to make decisions and make calls. And this notion of satisfying, where you make, I think it's important to know that we all make statements which would be, guilty of being bullshit to some extent. Most of us would do that quite significantly because we're starved of time, we're pressurized, and we have to make imperfect decisions with imperfect information. But we don't necessarily recognize that. We might frame it as being a certainty, as being a fact, and that's when it becomes dangerous. We have more information, we're overloaded with information in terms of how we work and how we do things. So that's probably the sort of key reason why it's so profound as we argue in terms of going forward. It's profound, and it has impacts in terms of people making decisions. Decisions based on statements where you go down a certain path of action, and then you say, did we really question, the veracity of that particular the statements in terms of going things, or was it like similar to like groupthink? We're all on the same page. We all say, yes, we're going to do this because we're all busy. We all want to do our best. So, bullshit is not always, done in a dark Machiavellian way, although it can be. But it's often done because people don't have enough slack, they don't have enough time, they can't do enough research, and they have to do things on the fly.
And in the research, you've got a lovely framework for which the acronym I thought was incredibly well chosen and most entertaining. And for listeners that haven't seen it, the framework is known as the CRAP framework, which is Comprehend, Recognise, Act and Prevent. And you've talked a little bit around comprehending. Can we look at the other aspects of the framework and kind of go through and understand how those work?
You look at the recognizing. I think most of us would, would say, we've been in meetings, we've been in conversations, and when we hear someone talk in very flowery, jargonistic ways where they're trying to impress, confuse, appeal to you in certain ways, we've all seen these conversations when people talk in that particular way. And so recognizing it as being able to say, first of all, you should expect it. You should expect it for all the reasons that we talk about in comprehending. We're overworked, we're stretched, we are more egalitarian in who we want to involve and invite. And so first of all, expect it. And then when you're expecting it, look for statements that are abstract, they lack sources, they lack logic, they're very opinion and view-based, and they're absolutely riddled with acronyms and jargon. And then that's a way of sort of allowing you as an individual to have a nose for bullshit, but remember it's bullshit versus lying, and therefore your response or how you act on it will be different, because lying is something where you have what the truth is, and you are deliberately subverting the truth, whereas bullshit is you have no regard for the truth. So I'll give you an example. I was looking at your background, and I see that you went to the University of Oxford. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So if I was to, say, because I had an agenda, that you had been to University of Cambridge because I had some sort of agenda and I wanted to position you in a certain way, but I did know that you had been to the University of Oxford, I am lying. Now, if I, had an agenda and I didn't know much about you, and I said, we shouldn't work with Christian because he's a supporter of Liverpool Football Club and we don't want to work with... So I have no idea whether you're a supporter of Liverpool Football Club. I'm just making it up. But you might actually be a supporter of Liverpool Football Club. So bullshitters can be accidentally correct because they have no knowledge or regard to the truth. They don't care about it. They're just making statements to frame you or frame certain agendas in certain ways. Whereas a liar does know the truth and deliberately sort of subverts it and walks around it in different ways. And so how you deal with that personally and how you survive in the workplace is very important to understand in terms of going forward. And so that's the importance of recognition, is that, you may say, why is this person lying to me? But they're not actually lying to you. They're bullshitting, and they may be bullshitting in a knowing way or an unknowing way. And your response to dealing with their statements and their agenda, the extent to which you counter them or help them, is based on that recognition.
Do you think there's any sense of cognitive dissonance on the part of a bullshitter when they discover that something they have said isn't accurate? Or does the dynamic of bullshitting mean that you don't actually have to think in those terms?
Again, don't know for certain. I'm just talking to what various literatures would say, but we know we have different mindsets. People have analytical mindsets, they have operational mindsets, they have social mindsets and creative mindsets. And I would say that if you have an analytical mindset, you're somebody, who doesn't like to multitask, does one job at a time, hates being wrong, focuses on getting the right answers. Being correct, being authentic is very, very important to your mindset. You will have a different nose for bullshit and a different reaction to it if you're not aware of the difference between bullshitting and lying.
And the third part of your framework is ACT, and you highlight in the research different ways to deal with bullshit that you encounter. That might mean going along with it. That might mean confronting, or it might mean just escaping from it. How do we decide what our response is in relation to bullshit that we come across?
It's a great question. So the four responses are, you exit you exit the environment which is riddled and flowing with bullshit. You voice or stand up, or you become loyal to it, or you sort of neglect it and become disengaged. And the answer to the question about which one of those you actually pursue depends on the costs. Exit is basically saying, you would leave the organization, or you would leave the organizational unit. And again, not everybody can do that. And so there are costs associated with that. It depends on where you work, the job market conditions at the time, how painful you personally find working in an organization which is flowing too much with bullshit for your liking. The second one is voice. This is the extent to which you can confront or speak up, or you can challenge and question. Again, that depends on the culture of the organization. It depends on your position in the organization. Are you a temporary worker? Are you a permanent worker? Are you senior? Are you junior? So there are costs associated with doing this. The loyalty aspect is the extent to which you just accept it and even reinforce it and spread it. And so if the bullshit is beneficial to you because it helps your budget, it helps your department, it helps your career, then you, even though you may recognize it, you're just loyal to it and you keep, playing along with it and you help it propagate. And, because it's beneficial, it's appealing to you. I think the last one, neglect, is probably a very common one. But again, these are all sort of research opportunities to see how people actually do respond and how it varies from different organizations. But neglect would be the extent to which you disengage. By disengage, I mean is you don't leave and pursue another career somewhere else, but you just don't turn up at work. You don't volunteer, you don't participate in meetings, you don't say anything. You just go to work, you self-optimize, you do what you need to do, but you're neither loyal, you're neither voicing or confronting the bullshit, and you're not leaving. And so the extent to which any individual pursues those opportunities depends on their personal circumstances. I work in a university, as you know, and so, we have professors who are used to academic freedom and reasonable levels of job security, so they're more likely to voice than other people would in other, industry situations and circumstances.
The final part of your framework is entitled Prevent, and that suggests that bullshit is something that is undesirable. And as you read the research, obviously there are circumstances under which, on an individual basis, it is in our interest, or we think it's in our interests, to go along with the bullshit. And I guess what I'm interested in is there circumstances, or are there circumstances under which, for an organization, something that one might term benevolent bullshit has a beneficial characteristics, and therefore we ought to actually not try and prevent it and just accept it as a natural part of human conversation and thinking?
If you were to ask many of my close friends, they would say I'm a really prolific bullshitter in certain circumstances, personally. But that's usually when I'm on fishing trips, or we're going to soccer games, or when we're outside of work. And so I think a world devoid of what Andre Spicer would call artisanal bullshits, where you're teasing, you're joking, you're stimulating, and you're engaging, but people are aware of this, and people are not hurt and upset by it. In most cases, of course, there can be circumstances when they do. It's just when you're in meetings where you're in the workplace and you're making big decisions, budgets, jobs matter, careers matter, and then this is where people should recognise the difference between such artisanal, joyful, friendly bullshitting and why it's done versus Machiavellian bullshit, which is trying to achieve certain agendas in a certain way, and has no grounding or reference to the truth. So yes, we agree that, and not just myself and my co-authors, but others would agree that organizations and societies that are completely devoid of any sort of bullshit are going to be very boring and probably sort of dull places.
It's interesting when you mention fishing, of course, because that is an environment that one might think of as being one that could be conducive to the perpetuation of bullshit in some form. But looking at the techniques that you describe for dealing with bullshit, one of them is to introduce more critical thinking. And one of the other things that you say in the research is that bullshitters are likely to be better at critical thinking, and therefore the very weapon that one might deploy against their dark arts is actually something that they are particularly good at. And I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition, that the skill that we need to overcome this is precisely the skill that the people that are deploying it are themselves using.
I think so too. I think that's a bit, and I think you'll do a very good job in terms of raising that, because I think, as stated in the paper, it's a little bit of an overstatement. I would say Machiavellian bullshitters will be very critical thinkers. So people who knowingly and carefully and with very defined agendas bullshit will be critical thinkers. People who unknowingly bullshit will, because of sloppiness, because of stress, because of lack of time, they will less likely be critical thinkers. So I think that's a very good point that you raise, and I'd like to sort of just put a caveat there around that, because I think it depends. There are different flavors of bullshit, as we're sort of raising here, and so the difference between knowingly and unknowingly bullshit, I think, is connected to the extent to which you possess a sort of strong capability in critical thinking or not.
So one of the other techniques that you refer to in the paper to combat bullshit is to eliminate meetings, committees, jargon. But these, of course, are mainstays of many organizations. And I think, we've all been to meetings that have been less than productive. We all recognize the dynamics you're talking about. But that's so prevalent that it's quite a big ask, isn't it, to get people to make this shift. And so much as we might all recognize it's the right answer, do you think it's actually feasible? Is this something that we can achieve, or is it so ingrained in the way that we do things that it's aspirational, but we're unlikely to be ever really able to do that on a large scale?
A great question. So first of all, the key thing is pointless meetings, and rather than meetings in general. Meetings are very important organizational mechanisms for doing work, and not just doing work, but also the social fabric of the organization. It's this issue of meetings where people's time, the agendas for the meeting, the purpose of the meeting, the process of the meeting has not been carefully thought out. As you know, I'm a professor in a business school, and one of the things we don't know much about, and certainly don't provide enough teaching about, is the science of meetings in workplaces. And so we have very good feelings, supported with evidence as well, that meetings cost a lot of money. Meetings are very powerful mechanisms, but if they're there to actually run sort of bullshit production little factories, because you don't have the right preventions in place to ask people to justify what they're saying, provide evidence, not careful with people's time, they just become these little sort of amplifying mechanisms, which they're first generating sources, and then they sort of amplify it through the organization. And it's just being cognizant of this, and I totally agree. It's I think most people, again, would say, yes, meetings are not run well enough. And so this is part of a bigger agenda of how you run meetings, design meetings, get decisions from meetings, and the evidence and the truth which is used to make those meetings happen would be central to that particular sort of mandated work.
That is a massive challenge. We're running out of time, Ian, but I did want to briefly touch on the broader scope of your research. And I know that you've done some work on deep fakes. You've looked at the dark side of social media. And I'm intrigued as to whether these are just 21st century manifestations of things that have always been there, or if there is something new that we are having to deal with that our cognitive processes possibly aren't built towards coping with. And I recognise that's a very broad question covering a broad church of work, but I'm just interested in the sort of broad thoughts you have around those dynamics.
Yeah, I think, misrepresentation, fakeness has obviously been around for a long, long time. But the way that we can connect to individuals in their homes, in their pockets. Eventually, when we're wearing wearable technology or even implantable technology, we can connect to individuals and we can frame things to appeal to those individuals in a certain way and to resonate with those individuals. Means that we live in a world where if you are, in the world of marketing, using what we call marketing puffery, where you're making overstatements or incorrect statements about things, or if you're presenting fake news in its various forms, or in organizations when you're communicating with employees and you're making fake statements and fake slogans which don't really reflect the values of the organizations, it's so easy to it's much easier to produce it, it's much easier to distribute it, and it's also much easier to customize it using the social media technology and other technologies that are emerging all the time. And so yes, that's extremely worrying. The costs of producing fake content, the costs of distributing fake content, and the cost of customizing it and framing it in ways that will be very powerful to the fake agenda are also going down. So all those costs are going down, and the reach and the impact is going up, and that's why we find ourselves in all these interesting discussions about media, which we probably weren't having 20, 30 years ago when we were just listening to radio stations and watching TVs and reading newspapers.
So, thank you so much, Ian, for sparing the time to appear on the podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I've also thoroughly enjoyed your research, all of which is highly recommended for my listeners. It has a real human risk resonance. Many of the things that you describe are dynamics where we are best case not getting the most out of people, and worst case actually crystallizing huge amounts of human risk. So fascinating stuff from a human risk perspective. Thank you very much for sparing the time to join me.
Thanks, Christian.
So that's it for another Human Risk podcast. My thanks, as I say, to Ian for joining me on the podcast and to you for listening. Now, before I go, do want to highlight the fact that Ian and his colleagues have a survey where you can respond and tell them about, well, let's call it workplace bullshittery in an environment near you. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Well worth doing to support their work. If you enjoyed the Human Risk podcast and aren't already a subscriber, you will find it wherever you get your podcasts. And I'd be very grateful if you had the time to leave a bit of feedback on the platform that you use. Simple reason being, the greater the profile of the show, the more I can continue to attract the kind of guests like Ian that we've managed to get so far. For more information on human risk, go to human-risk.com. and you'll find details of the newsletter and the video channel that I run on that website. I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. Thanks for listening.